So in today's video, I wanted to address the question, are you the thinker? So this might sound sort of like a funny question to ask or a funny topic, but by investigating this, we can get at uh, the difference between two different ways of perceiving thought, or two different ways of interacting with thought and consciousness. And by making contrast between these two, you might get some experiential insight of a more integrated, relaxed, peaceful, interconnected experience of thought than is typically available when we just go about the normal typical ways that we think. So without going into a lot of detail, at least in this video, about how our normal thought processes or our typical thought processes come about, or what the underlying mechanisms are, I just wanted to kind of approach this from an experiential standpoint and try to kind of guide attention in a way that allows us to get the direct feel in this moment of each way of interacting with thought. So the first way, I would say, is sort of business as usual. This is how we typically interact with thought, and the first sort of aspect, or the first description of that, is to say that it's semi conscious. So it's not that we're unconscious in the normal sense of the word, but semi-conscious in the sense that there's something that feels not fully there, not fully present. There's something that feels not fully integrated, like we're holding back from something, or we're not looking fully at something, or we're not fully experiencing the natural flow in the moments when this type of thought is predominant. So there's a sense of, there can be a sense of being somewhat unconscious or not present. A lot of times people will describe that. I feel like I haven't been present all day, or I don't feel present right now. I feel like I want to run off into my thoughts and imagination, and something's pulling me out of this moment, this present, out of this body, out of the sensations and the visual and auditory experiences of the moment. Something is holding some distance there. And I would argue that largely that is the relationship that we are habituated to enter into with the thought world. So in this first orientation, this first way of interacting with thoughts or relating to thoughts, it's somewhat of an unconscious feeling experience, and it's also a sort of distant feeling experience. We sort of feel distant, distant from life, distant from our experience, distant from our senses. This may be subtle, or this may be very obvious. It can also fluctuate moment to moment. It can fluctuate throughout the day, and it certainly can fluctuate throughout periods of your life, weeks, months, even years, where sometimes we feel much more here. We feel more integrated. Things feel more real, more vivid, and then other times things feel more distant, more one-dimensional, maybe, more held back from. Isolation is sort of the underlying experience, or the underlying emotion tone of that type of orientation, that distant experience. So specific to thoughts, if we investigate how this type of experience, this distant hesitant, isolated sort of feeling, if we look into how that plays out moment to moment when we interact with thoughts, this can give some insight. It kind of slows us down and can even stop us in our tracks and say, wow, okay, what is actually happening right now? What is my relationship with thought? In what ways am I interacting with thoughts in this moment? So first I want to just define what I mean by thought in a very simple, accessible way here. Simply mental images and mental sounds. The images look like your life, they look like you, they look like other people, they look like your past and your future, they look like memories, they look like imagined scenarios in the future. That's what I mean by images. Okay, so you could practice right now, you could look into your mind and say, okay, what does an image of 5 minutes ago look like? What was I doing 5 minutes ago? Can I imagine that? What was I looking at? Where was I? Was I in a different part of the house or wherever you might be watching this? We can imagine an image of tomorrow. What will I be doing tomorrow? Who will I be interacting with? Right? So it's visual. You might see color. You might see faces, locations. So those are images. Specifically what I'm talking about now, I just mean to say that when I say images, that's what I'm talking about. The other would be sounds. Sounds are typically voices, and they're typically conceptual in nature. You have your own inner voice. It might sound like you, might sound like your parent. A lot of times you're sort of unconscious to that inner voice. You're not seeing it as a sound. You're sort of looking from it in a way. But ultimately, these are auditory in nature and based on memory. So memory of conversations you've had, memories of things you've read, memories of self-talk. So when I say thoughts, I mean the images, as I described, and the auditory thoughts. If you're not completely clear on what I mean by an auditory thought, imagine a conversation you had with somebody, the most recent conversation you had with a friend or a colleague or a family member. Just imagine what you were talking about, remember it. That's what I mean by auditory, that's what I mean by sound thoughts. Okay, so thought can seem quite complex, but ultimately they're quite simple. The vast majority is images. The vast majority of thoughts are images and sounds. So conversations, talk, self-talk, and conceptual talk, as well as imagined scenarios, so places, events, people. Okay, so when I'm talking about thoughts, those are the two types I'm referring to. So if I'm talking or you're considering what I'm pointing to and you start to get lost in concepts and theories, remember that's all I'm talking about is whatever thoughts are arising in this moment. Okay, so this first arrangement with thoughts, this first orientation, this sort of distant, isolated, semi-conscious feeling we get with thought is when we are just lost in thought all day long, or we have a very busy mind and we feel like we have just been lost in a cacophony of thought. The orientation to those images and sounds in that that first scenario, that first type of thinking, is like watching a movie almost. There is a sense of distance. There's a sense of, I'm back here, the thought is out there, as if you're watching it from the point of view of a viewer watching a movie on a screen. Okay, so the images will be literally like the movie screen, and the sounds are sort of coming from different locations. So sometimes it seems like they're coming from the screen. Other times it seems like they're coming from you, the viewer and the audience, that you're not necessarily picturing. Right? This experience comes from a point of view of you, and from that point of view, you can experience yourself as a thinker, as a watcher, back here. When I say back here, I simply mean back away from and apart from the movie you're watching, the screen, the sounds. Okay, so that watcher, that thinker that sits back from the screen of thoughts. So this is that it has that feeling of isolation, that dualistic feeling. I am the thinker, and those thoughts are being thought. Now understand, if you look at it clearly in the way I'm describing right now, you can start to sense the thinker back here and the thoughts. But when we're moving through our daily life, we don't actually perceive it that way. What we actually perceive it as is myself, and then everything else. We perceive it as me, and then the world, my problems, my past and my future, the solutions to my problems, potentially, by imagining them in the future, the other people that are involved in my life, the more important people are thought about the most, and they are part of the problem and part of the solution, and we're manipulating all of these thoughts, okay? But all of that, including the world, the world meaning your life, your house, your job, your family, your friends, your past and future, and the actual world out there, the universe, everything. All of that is one pole of a certain polarity. The other pole of that is what is perceived to be you. But that perceived you is the part that's actually unconscious. That's the funny part about this. It's the perceived you itself is actually a thought in the way we're talking. It is a thought. The one back here, the one holding the view, that itself is actually part of that thought stuff, just as the world is. So that sets up a dualistic experience inside of thought, inside of consciousness. It sets up a sense that I'm always back here. I'm always opposed to everything out there. All of it needs to be managed somehow. All of it needs to somehow be solved, right? I need to get somewhere. I need to look back into the past and find out where the problems started, and then manage them somehow so that in the future, and this is all being imagined, in the future those problems will be solved or rearranged or overcome, and then we imagine what the new problems might be that result in that. All right, but this whole flow of thought about me, my problems in my life, and the future and the past, all of that is sort of one pole, okay, one side of a dichotomy. The other side of the dichotomy is the one doing all of that thinking, okay, and by being so vigilant to that thought stream, to the screen of visual images that are memories rearranged into various formations and sounds, by being so fixated on that, that becomes what seems so real to us. That thought world becomes very real, becomes very solid, very alive, seemingly. But we're forgetting that the more we make that alive, the more we give that life, that thought world, the more we start to push backwards into this sense of the self apart from it, the thinker, the sense of a thinker. So I started this video, the title being, Are You the Thinker? And it's a strange question to ask. It's an odd question. We don't think about these sorts of things. We don't ponder these. We don't investigate directly. But when this first orientation of thought, this first relationship with thought that almost all of us are in all the time, most of the time when we're awake, certainly, is constantly reinforcing a sense of a thinker, but it's doing it in an unconscious way. It's reinforcing the sense of the one that has the problems. It's reinforcing the sense of the one that has a past. It's reinforcing the sense of the one that has a future. Okay? So if this sounds disturbing, in the sense that what I'm suggesting is the one that's being suggested into being isn't solid or real in the way that life is solid and real, it's okay, because ultimately that isolation sense comes from setting up that partially unconscious or fully unconscious sense of self, apart from the whole world, apart from colors, sounds, smells, tastes, and then images, remembered sounds, conversations, concepts, the past and the future. That dichotomy itself, which actually starts to get set up at a very young age, that is actually the source of the discomfort. It's not, the source of discomfort isn't recognizing that sense of me back in here, the isolated one, might not be real in the way we think it is. Right? That can be disturbing to some people when they hear things like no self and that. But the no self really is referring to the sense of a separate self, the self apart from everything, the self that's always trying to defend itself, it's always trying to solve a problem, the problem of me, my life, right? That sense of separate self, that is the thinker, that is the watcher of thoughts, the watcher. And by recognizing the way this dichotomy gets set up and the way we voluntarily, well, I don't know if we voluntarily do it, but through habituation, we do it on an ongoing basis by investigating the nature of that relationship, that polarity between, again, the thoughts that seem to create my whole world and the me that's aware of those thoughts, that's watching the thought movie, that polarity that gets set up between those two. One half of it is sort of unconscious because it's the view we're looking from. So when we start to see how that arrangement works, how it feels, then we have an opportunity. We have an opportunity to recognize a completely different relationship, a completely different orientation with thought. And wouldn't that be surprising if finally recognizing that sense of a self apart from everything is a false orientation, and experiencing that directly so that we experience the world as self, the self as world, the view as what is viewed. We start to experience it as completely interpenetrated consciousness. Wouldn't that be great? And when that happens, it's a really, really strange thing. In a way, we see that the whole orientation we used to have towards thought was a complete facade. We were actually putting a ton of energy into trying to keep ourselves distant from what we think is life, the world, through our thoughts and concepts, through having problems, having a past, having a future. We've been energetically keeping distance, holding ourselves back here from that world in a way that constantly reinforces a false construct of separation. And then all of a sudden we stop putting that energy into it. And then, surprise, surprise, it's a far more natural state to just experience the interconnectedness of the one back here, the viewer, the knower, the thinker, and everything that it seems to have been thinking about, that it seems to have been contemplating, that it seems to have been watching on the movie screen. And this is the direct experience of consciousness, pure consciousness, that the thought stuff out of which the viewer is made, the sense of view, and the stuff out of which the world, your life, your problems, your past and future, all those images and sounds, all of that stuff that's made out of, is the same thing is as that which is viewing it. And this, you can hear what I'm saying and believe it and add it to your collection of thoughts, or you can directly investigate it experientially, thought by thought, in this moment. And those are vastly different experiences. When you directly experience it, it feels like a huge, massive relaxation. It feels like a sudden release of a lot of years of pent up isolation, fear, doubt, just vaporized. pure consciousness. Simple, boundless, effortless consciousness. Now, this can be experienced in a glimpse, in a little taste, or it can be realized. And what I mean by realized is ultimately an awakening. Sometimes it comes in tastes for a while, for a few weeks, months, even a couple of years, and then keep investigating. If you keep really questioning, what is this? What is the nature of thought? What is the nature of I? What is the nature of me, the thinker? What is that space of me right here that's interacting with thought? And you start to investigate it experientially, trying to find the dividing line between and recognizing there isn't one. Then all of a sudden, the whole thing can just reveal itself to itself. And you will be completely submersed in all of it. You become, in one sense, you become vast. In another sense, you become hard to find because you're already intermeshed with all of it. So it's a huge release, and that would be what I would call an awakening. It's when your identity stops being some sort of isolated experience that is constantly trying to defend itself, trying to solve its problem of life, constantly apart from and opposing everything, to consciousness, to pure, unbound consciousness. And when I say it's unbound, all I mean is that its identity is not lost when a thought arises. Doesn't mean there are no thoughts. It means thoughts become bliss. Thoughts become as enjoyable as the consciousness itself. Because it's very clear that nothing is threatened by the arising of a thought. No thought about your past or your future is threatening one iota anymore. Because it's already you. It's already part of what you are. What you are is primary. The I, the sense of I, is primary. It's universal. You can't not find it anymore. So whatever arises in that sense of I, in that consciousness, is perfectly okay. It's just a movement or an inflection of that consciousness. It's an inflection of the sense of I, the all-pervasive sense of unshakable sense of I. Not I as a person, not I as your name or your labels or your history or your past or your future, not that kind of I. It's the I that is not contingent upon any of that. So that would be an awakening. And that is actually just the start. Authentic awakening is life-changing at the most fundamental level. It's a transformation that doesn't go away in this lifetime. It can't go away because it opens to a much bigger reality than you had previously thought you were living in. So, but it's still just really the first step on the journey to a deeper realization, and it can get, well, it does get infinitely more profound, more intimate, more spontaneous, more interconnected. But that first step through the gate is life-shattering. Well, I shouldn't say life-shattering. It's life-altering. It's world-shattering. It is fundamentally the biggest shift you will go through in this lifetime. So once you've gone through that gate, the gateless gate, as in Zen they might describe it, then the orientation to thoughts changes. And that would be more like what I would describe as the second relationship with thought. The first part of this video I was describing the isolated, distant, separate, polar relationship with thought. And now I'm going to describe a more natural relationship with thought, a more intimate, non-threatening, integrated, spontaneous relationship with thought. And immediately after an awakening, typically there's a honeymoon period where this is quite effortless. Then things typically change a little bit, and some different type of work is required. It becomes a more physical investigation, a more investigation into emotion body, into the physicality of the body, and a deeper understanding, experiential understanding of the mechanisms that cause the sense of separation in the first place. But still, that relationship with thought is fundamentally changed, and it doesn't really change back. And so beyond that gate, or after an awakening, or sometimes even in glimpses before the awakening, the orientation to thought in this second description is more how things are. And that is, instead of looking at thought as a viewer in the theater, in the movie screen out in front, and always holding distance and trying to manage the world and manage your life and manage your past and future and your beliefs, and all the while reinforcing this sense of a thinker, of an isolated one back here that gets more and more isolated, more and more hidden, actually. So instead of that, it's sort of the opposite. It's more like the center is nowhere. There's not a viewer, back here, and life is out there. It's sort of like the center expands out into everywhere in direct experience, in the moment-to-moment sense of the space of you, the space of your consciousness. And it really has no boundary, and it has no separation or dividing line. And you could call this just consciousness, pure consciousness, pure I, pure sense of I. Some people describe it as a sense of I. Not everybody does. It's like pure knowing without a knowledge object. Pure knowing without having to have something to know. Just pure awakeness. And that is centerless and boundless. And no matter where you move, no matter where thought moves, all you find is more of yourself in this intuitive sense. Okay? So it's a great relaxation that is available here. We will still fight it in certain ways, and I will go into that in great detail in other videos, later stage awakening movements and so forth. But again, after this fundamental shift, there's always a knowing, deeply rooted in life, rooted in moment-to-moment experience. There's a deep knowing that really you're never isolated, and you're never threatened in the way that had been previously experienced. And so this centerless, vast, seamless, sort of interconnected space of consciousness is sort of always available. And certain inquiries and meditations can help lead us back to it after an awakening, but ultimately it's always there, sometimes in the background, sometimes much more in the foreground. And out of this space, this consciousness, arises thought. Now, thought can be about anything. It doesn't actually matter, but typically it's centered on the subject of you and your life. That's what is finally recognized as thoughts are really always about me, one way or another. They're either implied me, or they're literally about me. But if they're about the world, or they're about beliefs, or politics, or religion, or anything, they're still really ultimately about how you relate to those topics. If you're honest, if you're authentic and sincere, and you really look at this, you'll recognize it. So then, from this space of relaxation, this great relaxation, this peace, this sense of pure I, or if it's not pure I, just consciousness, from this sense of the non-threatened, always awake experience, we can start to reorient ourselves to thought. And actually it happens naturally. So instead of holding distance from thought, it's now clear that it arises sort of within us, but not inside the body in the way the mind imagines it. It sort of just fluctuates like waveforms inside of consciousness. That's how thoughts move. They arise and they subside into consciousness. Sort of like a sky full of clouds. One cloud might form or reform, but it's all sort of one seamless sky. That's how consciousness and thought are related. And it's a much more integrated experience. It's far less threatening. And if we trust the process, if we trust the wisdom of the awakening, which is really that nothing we can imagine could ever move us at all from ourselves, from this sense of I, from this sense of spacious interconnectedness, this oceanic experience. Then we start to proceed to deeper understanding, experiential understanding. And a thought feels like everything. A single thought feels like every part of everything, completely interconnected with everything, interconnected with the sounds, interconnected with the sensations in the body, the knees, the feet, the face. Those sensations are boundless as well. They don't have an edge or a border if looked at in direct experience. Thought is the same way. It has no edge, no boundary. Thought, consciousness, consciousness, thought, one and the same. One you could say is moving and one is standing still. But even that requires a thought. The stillness and the movement are not two. Completely interpenetrated with one another. And interpenetrated with other senses. That comes a bit later, but you can start to sense it early on after an awakening that the stuff of consciousness, of thought, also cannot be delineated from sound, color, sensation in the body. So then everything starts to feel centerless, boundless, without division. Very light, but very vivid, very clear. So this second orientation with thought that I'm describing, this second relationship with thought, leads directly into the non-dual. It itself is not true non-dual yet. It is more like a reflection of non-dual, and I'll describe that in other videos. But it leads directly into the non-dual, which is even a more profound, more effortless, if there is such a thing, more integrated, more vivid and pristine, centerless, but all-encompassing, and always releasing experience of reality. So maybe you can feel into those two modes of experiencing thoughts. Make a contrast, see the contrast. experientially. And I think the body mind is actually quite intelligent. It knows, once it can actually taste the difference, it knows which is more enjoyable, more natural, more comfortable. Through eons of habituation, though, we've really given a lot of momentum to that first thought orientation, that first thought relationship. We transmit it to each other all the time through nonverbal communication, through verbal communication. We transmit it to ourselves and reinforce it. So it has a lot of momentum. So it can take a bit before the body mind really starts to taste that second relationship and integrate it. But it does work, and it does absolutely happen. So give it a chance. Investigate directly. See if you can't find some direct experiential aspects of the second descriptions. And good luck. Let me know if you have questions.